Imagine finding out your fake mobster fiancé picked you because he was planning to die. Ara Quinn realizes a horrifying truth during a kitchen confession. The man who slid a diamond ring on her finger wasn't actually trying to save his own life. He had already decided to die to take down his father's empire, and he specifically picked a widow because he knew she understood the heavy price of grief. It was never a rescue. It was a suicide mission.
Today, you and I are going to unpack a fascinating psychological profile together. Picture a dim, shadowy mahogany bar. A diamond ring suddenly strikes the wood, the sharp noise echoing like a gunshot. Ara Quinn, a woman whose entire existence revolves around clinical logic, goes completely rigid. Her bourbon glass simply stops in midair. A stranger's hand covers hers, forcing a heavy stone onto her finger. He leans close, his tone a terrifying, calculated hum. "Smile, sweetheart," he murmurs. "Smile like you love me, because 3 hitters just walked inside. Play my fiancée or we both die." The life lesson here is brutally simple. You can meticulously plan every single hour of your life, but absolute chaos only needs a fraction of a second to rewrite your reality. Ara spent decades constructing a mental fortress built entirely on cold, predictable facts. But the exact moment that freezing metal meets her skin, her illusion of absolute safety disintegrates. The stranger locks his fingers tightly over hers. His grip is not physically painful, but as a behavioral analyst, I recognize it immediately. It is the overwhelming physical pressure of an absolute threat. It is a chilling reminder that the towering psychological walls we spend years building can collapse from just one unexpected touch. In a single, frantic heartbeat, the reality of the crisis sets in. This predator just put his survival into her trembling hands. "Do not look at the door," he whispers. "Look at me." Her throat goes dry as dust. The trap has officially snapped shut. The dim lighting captures his features with cinematic cruelty. I have sat across from men exactly like this in maximum security prisons. Men shaped by extreme violence, their expressions hardened by years of unspoken regret. He wears a bespoke suit worth more than Ara earns in 12 months, but his eyes betray him. They are the color of a frozen lake, harboring ghosts he refuses to name. He offers her a smile that is genuinely terrifying in its sheer perfection, projecting the radiant warmth of a devoted groom. We all wear social masks, but this man elevated deception to a clinical art form. "Breathe, Ara," he whispers smoothly. "How do you know my name?" she stammers, her voice fracturing. Later, he commands. She tries to obey, but her muscles remain locked in pure fear. Ara stares down at her own hand, shaking violently beneath his unyielding hold. This is the exact same hand that spent 8 grueling hours this morning, executing precise surgical procedures. Now, pinned beneath the weight of this diamond, her rational control totally vanishes. "Good girl," he murmurs, lowering his pitch to a hypnotic hum. "Now laugh." Ara nearly chokes on the absurd command. "Laugh," he insists. "Lean into me like I just shared a dirty secret." "I do not know how," she begs quietly. "Yes, you do." His thumb traces a slow, methodical path across her skin. From a psychiatric perspective, we often forget how deeply the mind craves touch until it is applied under sheer duress. "Just laugh," he demands. And trapped inside this lethal psychological snare, she obeys. The sound literally scrapes its way up her throat. It is a fragile, hollow noise carrying far more profound sorrow than actual joy, yet it successfully paints the illusion he requires. She leans against his solid chest, mimicking a woman totally anchored to her partner. Let us look at this piece by piece, shall we? Across the dark room, she can actually feel the heavy, violent scrutiny of those 3 assassins shifting away. Psychological lesson here is stark. Sometimes, The absolute highest form of human bravery is simply committing fully to the terrible hand you are dealt. Good, he exhales quietly. Pick up your drink with your left hand. Let them see the stone. Who are they? And she panics. Drink first, he orders. Ara reaches blindly for the glass of bourbon. That diamond is an artifact of extreme wealth, a stone that broadcasts pure, unadulterated dominance. She lifts her glass, allowing the sharp bite of the alcohol to force her tense nervous system into temporary submission. Without warning, his arm wraps firmly around the small of her back. In behavioral terms, this is a calculated, highly public claim of physical territory. The fascinating psychological twist here is that she does not flinch. "There is my girl," he whispers into her hair. "I am not your girl," she replies, tasting bitter defiance. "Tonight you are," he counters without missing a single beat. "Tonight you are the love of my life, Ara, and you will save it." A desperate mind will manipulate absolutely any available variable to ensure its own survival. Her core instincts scream that a violent criminal cycle has invaded her quiet sanctuary. That bourbon, bought to simply numb her profound fatigue, is now a mandatory stage prop in a deadly theatrical performance. She nervously tugs at her borrowed dress. Her sister had forced it on her just hours prior, begging her to pretend to be happy. You and I have probably both made this kind of mistake. It is almost always our smallest, most reluctant concessions that accidentally march us directly into our darkest nightmares. That fragile piece of clothing is the only reason she chose that specific bar stool, putting her right into the orbit of an apex predator. She just wanted 10 minutes to drop her mask. Instead, she is completely held hostage in a psychological war zone. She merely wanted a tiny window of time to let her heavy defensive armor fall away. Her strategy was to retreat into her usual clinical isolation. But reality possesses a brutally dark sense of humor regarding our careful blueprints. Her little escape lasted exactly 4 minutes. "Look at me again," Adrian orders, a spike of genuine urgency finally bleeding through his terrifying calm. "Do not check that door. I can feel them watching us." At this invasive proximity, she can physically map the history of his trauma. See this often in criminal profiles, a jagged scar breaking his brow line, telling a story of past brutality. He smells of crushed cedar and expensive fabric, a highly sophisticated veneer built to conceal the raw, calculated danger buried underneath. If you watch the security footage, they look like a romantic masterpiece. Two lovers utterly consumed by one another. "What is your name?" she whispers, desperately seeking any logical data to anchor her spiraling brain. "Adrian," he replies. "Adrian what?" Later, he deflects with the practiced ease of a career manipulator. "You already said it later about how you knew Mime Chang-Shi," challenges trying to win back fraction of control. In that microscopic second, his perfect facade cracks. He offers a smile steeped in deep tragedy. Vulov, he finally confesses. That specific surname carries the suffocating gravity of organized crime. Adrian Vulov. Listen, in 90 seconds, the man in grey will ask a question. Whatever he asks, your answer is yes. "Yes, and I love him." "Are you listening?" he demands, stripping away all gentleness. "Say the words back to me." "Yes, and I love him," she recites. "Yes, and we got engaged tonight." "Good girl," he whispers. A bizarre warmth blooms in her chest at his validation. I analyzed this same dynamic when studying Luca's trauma under the kingpin Vittorio. It is the early onset of Stockholm Syndrome, where the victim desperately seeks the captor's approval to survive. "Why me?" she asks. He picks up her glass with the fluid intimacy of a devoted husband. He takes a slow sip before delivering the clinical truth. "Because you were alone." Because you were not smiling. Because nobody in this entire packed room is looking at you, Ara. You are completely invisible to them, making you the absolute perfect shield. Every soul in this building is tethered to someone else, he continues quietly. They all project a clear narrative of belonging. You do not. She stares at him, totally paralyzed by this cold audit of her entire existence. That is the worst answer I have ever heard. She snaps defensively. It is the only honest one I possess, he replies. You do not know me, she argues, desperate to rebuild her boundaries. No, he agrees. You do not know if I will play along. No. I could walk out those doors and you would be executed. Yes. She frantically searches his face for markers of panic. There are none. Vittorio operated the exact same way. The pure megalomaniac narcissist viewing life as fatal mathematics. I would die, Adrian repeats. And so would you. The only thing keeping you breathing is the fragile illusion that you matter to me, he says. So, please. His carefully controlled voice actually fractures on that single word. That microscopic break entirely shifts the psychological paradigm. Ara has spent her medical career decoding the silent suffering of those who cannot speak. She deeply understands the heavy stillness of a wounded animal accepting its grim fate. Now, she hears that exact same tragic frequency coming from a lethal syndicate enforcer. Come with me. You're about to find out what really happens when boundaries dissolve. Driven by a clinical empathy she cannot suppress, she turns her palm upward. She laces her shaking fingers through his iron grip. Okay, she breathes. He shuts his eyes in profound relief. Subject Ara exhales a fractured breath against Adrian's coat, but his grip instantly hardens, a non-verbal command to initiate a freeze response. The room dims as the massive presence of Yuri Rashevsky eclipses them. You and I have likely observed this physiological reaction, where the amygdala screams before the conscious brain processes the threat. Yuri moves like a rusted tank, his scarred face unreadable, his eyes assessing Ara like a butcher grading meat. Adrian compresses her fingers, murmuring a desperate directive for her to smile. She forces her facial muscles into compliance. It is a harsh clinical reality that sometimes projecting a fabricated state of joy is the only psychological raft you have to survive a lethal environment. Finally, the predator exhales the name Volkov. The most psychopathic variable here is the modulated softness of Yuri's tone. He speaks with paternal warmth, devoid of overt aggression. A hallmark of advanced manipulative pathology, Adrian mirrors this flawlessly, anchoring to that same relaxed frequency. He maintains his physical hold on Ara's trembling hand, swiveling on his stool with the calculated grace of a civilian enjoying a date. Yuri casually notes Adrian's health, while Adrian softly counters with feigned exhaustion. Yuri releases a low chuckle before his gaze drags back to Ara. His visual assessment is agonizingly slow, tracking from her pallid face down to the massive diamond ring. He offers a slow smile. We must always remember that a warm expression, lacking micro-movements around the eyes, is the deadliest mask a monster can wear. Yuri demands her identity, his gentle cadence slicing the tense environment. Ara experiences severe dry mouth, a classic sympathetic nervous system response. Let us examine this together, because we have all faced paralyzing terror where higher cognition fails and pure survival instinct takes over. She barely vocalizes her name. The narcissist praises her Russian genetics with a chilling grin, asking how an innocent specimen ended up with Adrian. Bypasses logical restraint. She impulsively states that he proposed. The confession hangs suspended, creating a vacuum identical to the quiet before a catastrophic collision. Adrian compresses her hand in gratitude. The clinical lesson is profound. When reality fractures under extreme trauma, a blind leap into absolute deception is often the only psychological escape route. Yuri echoes her claim, fascinated by the psychological deviation. Within the neurological chaos, Ara identifies the structural rhythm of her own fabrication. She drops into hyperfocus like a surgeon operating under fire and locates a twisted equilibrium. She constructs a narrative detailing how Adrian brought her to a freezing balcony, dropped to one knee, and secured her consent. She turns to Adrian, projecting a synthesized manifestation of romantic attachment. It is an adaptive behavior born of panic, yet it illuminates a fundamental human truth. Desperate terror can perfectly mimic the physiological arousal of true intimacy if the subject hits the correct behavioral markers. She repeats her affirmative response, and Adrian reinforces the illusion, pressing his lips to the diamond on her shaking hand. Adrian leans close to her, his vocal modulation controlled. Declaring her yes was his greatest victory. Yuri observes the pair, his gaze heavy like an atmospheric depression. The silence stretches into psychological distress. Then, the kingpin emits a massive laugh that shakes the floorboards. Ara feels her paralyzed spinal column finally release its tension. Yuri notes he never hypothesized Adrian entering a domesticated state, warning his father will experience severe cognitive dissonance. Adrian pleasantly agrees. Yuri pivots back to unresolved operations, dropping a weighted silence that Ara detects through Adrian's muscular contraction. Yet, Adrian maintains perfect physical stasis. Clinical observation proves that maintaining absolute physiological calm is the most impenetrable armor you can deploy when mortality risk reaches critical levels. Yuri initiates a psychological trap, inquiring if she comprehends their illicit enterprise. Ara establishes direct eye contact with the megalomaniac and states she possesses sufficient data. Yuri analyzes her with the predatory focus of a dominant carnivore, asking what exactly she knows enough to do. Without a microsecond of hesitation, she fires back, enough to say yes. It is a stunning display of oppositional defiance, catalyzed by the primal circuitry of an entrapped organism fighting for its existence. Yuri fixates on her for one suffocating interval before roaring with approval. He strikes Adrian's shoulder, commending him for capturing a true wolf. This interaction provides a crucial behavioral lesson. Projecting sociopathic levels of unwavering confidence is the ultimate defensive mechanism when you are statistically guaranteed to lose. Adrian stares at his glass, validating that he acquired a predatory mate. Yuri vocalizes his benedictions and inserts a heavy hand into his custom coat. Ara experiences acute muscular rigidity, her brain calculating an imminent ballistic threat. Observe this closely, because the tension shatters when Yuri merely extracts a cardstock rectangle. He propels it across the surface, mandating an invitation to facilitate the delivery of a tribute. Adrian executes a polite acceptance, guaranteeing the resumption of their operations. Yuri signals his subordinates, and the hostile entities evacuate the premises. Their departure illustrates a grim psychological reality. The gradual recession of a mortal threat is frequently more traumatizing than the confrontation itself, because the subject is left knowing the predator remains active, merely waiting in the shadows. The millisecond the door secures itself, the psychological containment collapses. Ara's survival mechanisms crash, resulting in severe motor tremors. The removal of the stressor exposes her nervous system to the trauma payload. Adrian minimizes the gap, utilizing an urgent tone to countermand her decompensation. She articulates an inability to suppress the spasms, but he maintains uncompromising detachment, instructing her to ingest the alcohol and sustain her fabricated affect. His thumb initiates grounding tactile stimulation against her skin. He directs her attention to the surrounding observers. Their fixation underscores a brutal behavioral axiom. You and I must recognize the environment never ceases its surveillance. Even when your internal architecture is collapsing, basic survival mandates the continuous execution of your public script. Adrian mandates prolonged behavioral modification, demanding she consume the alcohol. Ara forces a smile, but the expression registers as a muted distress signal. Adrian provides auditory reinforcement, labeling her a compliant subject. That trigger initiates a failure of her emotional suppression. Her residual terror transmutes into volatile aggression, demanding data regarding the predatory entity. Adrian deploys a classic deflection technique, guaranteeing a debriefing later. She presses the unresolved variables, but he cycles back to his obfuscation. She strikes her glass against the bar, the fraudulently acquired gem catching the light. She demands factual transparency and an extraction protocol. The psychiatric takeaway is paramount. Never accept ambiguous guarantees of future safety when your biological instinct demands immediate factual resolution. A shift in Adrian's facial musculature exposes a variable that clinically resembles genuine grief. He softens his vocal output, offering a window to recalibrate her nervous system. She accepts this, ingesting the ethanol while his hand remains locked around hers. She permits him a grooming behavior, tucking hair behind her ear, executing the role of an infatuated partner with sociopathic precision. The observer in crimson finally ceases her surveillance. The environment resumes its standard loop, but within Ara's cognitive framework, a catastrophic paradigm shift occurs. She remembers a compromised animal at her clinic, a gathering upstairs, and a waiting family. The psychodynamic lesson is severe. A singular, chaotic interval and one desperate survival choice can permanently overwrite the baseline trajectory of a previously unremarkable existence. Ara attempts to re-anchor to baseline civilian identity. The data is irreconcilable. An unidentified operator affixed a diamond to her hand, and she utilized cognitive framing to survive a syndicate interrogation. However, the limbic system is a dangerously adaptable mechanism. We observe here the classic onset of traumatic bonding. A microdose of positive reinforcement can instantly destabilize psychological defenses. When Adrian administered that validation, a calcified pathway within her emotional center bypassed its inhibitors. It permitted an influx of warmth she had denied herself throughout a 36-month mourning cycle. She shifts her focus to his face. There is no narcissistic triumph displayed. He presents solely as a depleted organism that has located a thermal refuge in a hostile climate. He exhales her name into the space between them. Adrian terminates the silence, admitting he incurred a catastrophic operational debt. Ara exhibits zero latency, validating his deficit is absolute. He guarantees restitution, but when she queries his methodology, he reverts to silence. He elevates her hand with calibrated care. His gaze maps the diamond, then drops to the dermal abrasions on her joints, the markers of a practitioner who preserves life via surgery. He establishes a contract to rectify the damage, independent of collateral cost. Let us analyze this concluding tableau together. A melancholic holiday composition permeates the airspace, enveloping a traumatized surgeon and a Machiavellian syndicate heir. It highlights the ultimate clinical lesson. An organism can execute every behavioral protocol flawlessly, and its reality can still suffer irreversible systemic collapse in mere milliseconds. Let us open the clinical file on these two. When we observe Ara here, her psychological defenses are entirely decimated. She offers a fragile smile to a lethal syndicate boss, whispering that he is going to systematically dismantle her life. Adrian, a textbook megalomaniacal narcissist, allows a faint smirk to break his composure. He whispers that he likely will. Long after, the rival thugs dissolve into the wind. His grip on her hand remains punishingly tight. Beneath his terrifying criminal reputation, this predator is desperately clinging to a stranger. You and I must recognize the pathology at play. The most dangerous monsters hold on the tightest because they are secretly terrified of drowning alone in their own dark waters. She whispers that he can finally let go. Adrian barely nods, negotiating for just 1 single minute more. As Ara studies his face, she uncovers a deeply unsettling contradiction. He flashes the warm, disarming smile of a man who just secured the love of his life. But his dark eyes betray the hypervigilance of a caged predator, dart frantically between the heavy oak doors and the shadows behind the bar. Ara murmurs that her fingers are going numb, snapping his cold dissociation. Realizing the physical violence of his grip, his carefully constructed mask slips. He instantly softens, cradling her bruised hand while whispering a rough apology. We often forget a grim clinical reality. The truest battle is hiding total internal panic behind a flawless, perfectly constructed smile. Adrian insists they must project the illusion of desperate lovers and walk out into the cold together. Avra absolutely refuses this psychological manipulation. She fires back that her phone, her family, and her completely normal life are waiting safely upstairs. She reminds him she does not even know his middle name. Adrian simply stares back, clinically stating he does not have one. Snatching her hand away, she slams both palms against the mahogany bar. Her breathing grows violently shallow as the blinding diamond on her finger catches the low light. We see a classic acute stress response here. It is a devastating lesson to learn under extreme pressure. Pretending to be someone else is often the precise behavioral trap that seals your fate forever, dragging you straight into the dark. Ara feels the lethal gravity of this stone dragging her psyche down. Growing up with nothing, she developed an adaptive survival skill, telling cheap glass from a flawless diamond long before she could do basic math. This heavy rock is painfully real. Her voice shakes as she demands the price. Adrian warns her to drop the interrogation, but she pushes until the atmosphere turns suffocating. He finally murmurs the truth. $200,000. Ara physically reels back, shutting her eyes tight, begging him to strip the terrifying object from her hand. Instead, he leans close, delivering a fatal psychological blow. She cannot remove it now. Not here, not anywhere. True danger begins the precise moment you realize the steel trap has already snapped permanently shut around your throat. Listen to the frozen rain punishing the window. You and I are stepping into the clinical dark together, watching two desperate souls negotiate their survival. Adrian leans in close, his voice dropping to a gravelly rumble. He dictates that the ring stays on until they are sealed inside his armored car. Ara is drowning in a panic attack, completely unable to trust this violent narcissist. When she forces her eyes open, Adrian is staring straight through her defense mechanisms. His freezing gaze makes her stomach plummet as he delivers a horrific reality check. Two assassins are still lingering in the alley. Leaving this bar alone equates to certain death. It reveals a deeply grim truth about survival. One single misstep in a ruthless game permanently erases your existence from the earth. Adrian presents the unforgiving, calculated truth. Either of them could be in a body bag by dawn. The bourbon burns Ara's throat, twisting. Stomach. That cursed diamond feels like an iron anchor dragging her subconscious down. Everything is being she rebuilt after her husband 3 years ago is being utterly consumed by his dark empire. Trembling, she demands to know why he dragged her into his personal pathology. Adrian releases a broken sigh, displaying the affect of a man haunted by ghosts. He stares into his glass and delivers the cruelest confession. He chose her because, when death walked through the door, she was the only one who did not flinch. Unhealed trauma will always recognize its own shattered reflection, even in the cold, dead eyes of a total stranger. The megalomaniac lays out his logic with chilling, clinical clarity. When he hijacked her evening, forced a ring onto her finger, and warned of assassins, Ara never made a single sound. A neurotypical civilian would have screamed. Instead, she went completely still, like a cornered animal calculating pure survival. Adrian is not offering a compliment. He is delivering a grim psychiatric diagnosis. Ara glares at him as the tragic reality shatters her illusions. He selected her precisely because he recognized the invisible scars of a psyche that was already destroyed. His heavy silence confirms it, sending a wave of ice through her veins. You can never hide your profound grief from a man who lives entirely in the dark. He saw right through her carefully built psychological walls. Ara never consented to have her ruined psychology dissected tonight. She is simply an exhausted woman in a borrowed dress, attempting to survive a miserable party. She levels her gaze at the syndicate boss, her vocal tone as lethal as broken glass. She will walk to his car solely because she refuses to bleed out on a cold floor. But she draws an absolute, rigid boundary. The exact second she is safe, this twisted engagement dies. He will take his sparkling lie back, erase her from his memory, and face his assassins alone. She forces him to speak the behavioral terms out loud. Adrian holds her gaze, absorbing her panic, and solemnly vows to let her go. Let us be entirely honest about this grim reality. A desperate promise forged in the shadows is always destined to be violently broken. Ara swallows the burning dregs of her bourbon, slamming the crystal down so hard it nearly shatters. Her eyes blaze with tragic resolve as she demands his instructions. Adrian tells her to stand up and play the role of a woman infected with infatuation. She must let him wrap his heavy coat around her, summon a blinding laugh, and step into the howling night tangled in his embrace. He asks softly if she has the psychological stomach for the lie, and she gives him a dead, unwavering yes. He murmurs a rare word of thanks, but Ara shuts it out. She rises to her feet, the diamond shackle dragging at her trembling hand. The exact second the door of his armored sedan violently seals her inside, the heat hits her. Escaping one hell usually delivers you directly into another. The instant the armored door clicks shut, the chaotic world outside ceases to exist. The cabin smells of rich leather and suffocating danger. Seconds ago, the freezing wind was deafening, but inside this rolling vault, the sensory deprivation is absolute. This car was built for men who require a bulletproof wall against behavioral consequences. Adrian murmurs a single name, and the massive sedan glides into the shadows. Agonizing quiet swallows the space. Ara presses against the door, staring blankly through the heavy tinted glass. She spots an exhausted man in a cheap Santa suit, ringing a lonely bell. It looks like a distant reality she is no longer permitted to access. Sudden trauma can instantly turn your safe, ordinary world into a ghost you can never touch again. Joy is a deeply cruel concept when a patient is drowning in grief. To Ara, happiness is a bright room she has been locked out of since her husband died. Adrian's low voice suddenly sliced through the tension, telling her she can finally take the diamond off. But Ara just stares at the stone, paralyzed by the early stages of Stockholm Syndrome. Panic rising, she demands to be taken to her apartment. Adrian shuts it down immediately. Desperate, she begs to be left on a random corner in the freezing dark. But the narcissist refuses to let her sign her own death warrant. As streetlights slice across his hardened face, he offers a secure hotel, swearing he will not follow her inside. In a world built entirely on antisocial lies, genuine trust is the rarest currency of all. Adrian promises his driver will escort her to the suite. She can lock the heavy door and isolate until morning. He swears they will negotiate her freedom at dawn, but tonight he demands she keep that ring on her finger. Ara shoots him a venomous glare. Their behavioral contract was supposed to terminate the second she stepped into his car. You and I must watch carefully here. Adrian observes her with a bone-deep exhaustion weighing down his shoulders. He quietly shatters her psychological defense. She was the one who shouted those terms, and he never actually agreed to them. Turning toward her in the dim amber light, he admits she did something profoundly brave for him tonight. We often stumble upon the most grace in the absolute darkest, most pathological moments of our lives. Let us pause, you and I, and observe how perfectly this psychological trap closes around Ara. Adrian promised his fortune would be a shield, but men like Yuri operate with predatory memory. By sunrise, his operatives will dissect her entire existence. The clinic, the fragile family ties, the agonizing shadow of her late husband. When Adrian mentions her dead partner, Ara exhibits a textbook trauma response, physically recoiling. She demands to know how he obtained her ghosts. The clinical truth? He executed a full background check before the ice in her drink melted. It is classic narcissistic boundary violation. The psychological lesson here is simple but absolute. In an environment populated by smiling predators, your deepest secrets are never as secure as you desperately want them to be. It took his driver exactly 8 minutes to extract the painful blueprint of her existence. Adrian states, with the flat affect of a seasoned sociopath, that rival men will possess that file by daylight. The only variable keeping Ara alive is the illusion that she belongs to him. That fake diamond ring suddenly acts as a clinical restraint. She lashes out, voice trembling with raw fury at the violation of her autonomy. Adrian attempts to placate her, swearing he only did it for survival. Ara cuts him off, forbidding him from weaponizing her grief. She turns away, repressing her tears. We can learn from her behavioral resistance here. Refusing to fracture in front of the monsters attempting to cage you is the ultimate display of psychological dominance. Ara maintains a rigid defensive posture in the dim light of the sedan. For 3 years, she compartmentalized her sorrow, refusing to let this criminal witness her unravel. She commands Adrian to recite the exact data his dossier contains about her husband. He pauses, demonstrating a rare flicker of cognitive empathy, aware of the devastation approaching. Daniel Quinn, 36. Paramedic. 3 years ago, while saving a stranger, he was struck by a vehicle and left on the freezing asphalt. Hearing that sterile report spoken aloud is emotionally agonizing. It presents us with a harsh truth about the human psyche. Genuine strength is never about ignoring your darkest trauma, but rather having the mental fortitude to look it directly in the eye. you and I have seen how profound grief transforms vibrant individuals into hyper-vigilant ghosts. For 3 years, her support system relied on soft euphemisms like the accident. Yet this mobster just stacked up her worst memories and calmly struck a match. Her voice is a hollow whisper as she questions his cruelty, pointing out she just stitched his physical wounds hours prior. Adrian attempts to hide behind survival protocol, but Ara detects the micro-expression of tension in his jaw. Cornered, he admits there was a secondary motive, letting a heavy silence saturate the leather seats. This interaction reveals a fascinating behavioral pattern. The individuals who most aggressively violate our personal boundaries are very often desperately trying to mask their own terrifying secrets. Adrian breaks the silence, revealing the psychological baggage he carries. He confesses he read her file to establish an asymmetrical baseline of trust. He clinically owns his dark nature, admitting he survives by deceiving rival cartels and his own megalomaniacal father. But to Ara, he promises absolute truth. She immediately rejects this, sarcastically labeling him a liar to his face. For a fleeting second, the hardened criminal exhibits amusement, confessing he actually rehearsed that dramatic speech. A wild, hysterical urge to laugh rises up in Ara. It is terrifying how easily this dangerous man can disarm her trauma. The clinical reality here is profound. Humor is a sharp cognitive weapon that can instantly bypass the emotional walls we spend years building for protection. As the sedan glides past ordinary civilians, Ara demands a rational motive. What exactly does a Mafia heir gain from a fabricated marriage? Adrian stares at the passing asphalt, his affect dropping completely flat. He murmurs that he just needs more time. When she refuses his evasive maneuver, a crushing physiological weight visibly settles over his posture. It is the bone-deep, exhausted gaze you typically document in institutionalized inmates. With quiet, agonizing honesty, Adrian confesses he is desperately trying to escape his father Mafia empire before it completely erodes his sanity. It is a profound reminder of the human condition. Every person you encounter is fighting a terrifying secret war, even the individuals who appear entirely untouchable on the surface. Let us analyze the architecture of this trap together. Escaping a criminal syndicate is never a simple exit strategy. Adrian knows his father would terminate his own heir before letting him walk. To survive, he had to construct a deception so flawless that the sociopaths below him would accept it as reality. Ara processes this and asks the logical question: why not select a woman you actually love? The silence in the car grows suffocating. He finally looks away and confesses he has literally no one. In his violent reality, emotional attachment is an absolute death sentence. The second a target becomes known, they become leverage. The tragic lesson here is undeniable. Sometimes the singular method to protect a fragile heart from a toxic environment is to keep it entirely isolated. Adrian asks if she comprehends the situation, and Ara absorbs that reality like a slow-acting neurotoxin. The horrific psychological variables calculate in her mind. He targeted her because she is completely alone. He chose her because she lacks a family network for his enemies to leverage. Adrian offers zero defensive rationalization. His heavy silence confirms the clinical diagnosis. She whispers that it is the cruelest manipulation anyone has ever subjected her to. He solemnly agrees. Yet she quietly admits it is also the most honest thing, lost in the wreckage of her own isolation. She leans against the freezing glass as snow falls outside. The lesson here cuts like a scalpel. Sometimes raw honesty inflicts far deeper psychological trauma than any carefully constructed lie ever could. He is demanding 6 weeks of her existence. 6 weeks of Ara playing the devoted partner under the highly observant gaze of pathological killers. He needs her to sell this trauma bond to the predators circling his empire before granting her freedom. But Ara possesses too high an intellect to accept blindly. She demands to know the statistical probability of failure if the Don discovers the truth. Adrian goes deadly quiet, shadows mapping his jawline. He mutters that if the deception fails, they will face a violent consequence, the kind that tracks you to your sanctuary and waits in the dark. The behavioral lesson here is chilling. Pure psychological desperation will always push a broken individual to gamble their mortal life at the absolute worst possible table. You and I must appreciate the psychological whiplash here. Ara closes her eyes, the diamond registering as a physical anchor. 3 hours ago, her baseline was stable, managing minor veterinary crises in faded scrubs. Now, she is negotiating survival with a crime syndicate, but instead of submitting, she establishes absolute behavioral dominance. She dictates strict parameters, no more deception. He can manipulate the megalomaniac who bred him, but he must never lie to her. If he does, she will terminate the arrangement immediately. Adrian instantly complies. Remember this mechanism because human psychology proves it constantly. You can only demand absolute truth from someone when you are entirely prepared to sever the attachment and walk away forever. Ara continues to construct her psychological fortress. She establishes the ultimate firm boundary. She keeps her clinic. If his cartel associates even look toward the subjects she protects, the contract is void. She walks, and he must let her go. A tense, measurable silence fills the vehicle before he agrees. But Ara is highly perceptive. She registers his delayed response and calls out the hesitation. Adrian locks his exhausted eyes onto hers and issues a dangerous admission. He confesses he hesitated because he lacks the certainty that he can actually let her go when the timeline concludes. It is a text symptom of toxic attachment. The rigid boundaries we enforce to protect our peace are often the exact triggers that compel broken individuals to dismantle them. Pay close attention to this final behavioral exchange. Outside, hotel neon lights flash like a psychological warning stimulus. A doorman waits in the rain to let this violent underworld absorb her. Ara exhibits minor tremors, stating he gave the wrong answer. Adrian replies with depressive regret, admitting it was his only factual response. She evaluates him coldly, predicting with absolute certainty that he will destroy her life. He offers a fragmented smile as the sedan halts. On her hand, the fake diamond refracts the glare, anchoring her to an inevitable trauma bond. This highlights a deeply tragic element of the human brain. We consistently attach ourselves to the toxic variables that guarantee our destruction, mesmerized by the intense stimulation of their danger. She leaves the ring on. Let us open this clinical file and examine the pathology of devastation together. The clock ticks to 6:14 in the morning, casting a jaundiced glow across a transient hotel room. The subject, Ara, remains frozen on the mattress. Her heavy coat is buttoned to her chin, wet shoes bleeding dark stains into the carpet. Her pupils fixate on the syndicate ring on her finger. She perceives it not as a gift, but as a cold trap of psychological captivity. She has dissociated entirely, ignoring 12 desperate calls from Marin. There is a fundamental behavioral truth we must accept. Fear exacts a massive toll, and refusing to confront your own deeply rooted demons only forces those you cherish most to pay the ultimate price. Ara constructs a fragile cognitive distortion, whispering into the receiver that she is perfectly stable. But Marin easily detects the micro-tremors in her breath. Marin's voice fractures with raw panic, stating her husband is currently scouring the rain-slicked streets. She alerted the authorities 40 minutes prior. Terrified Ara suffered a psychotic break. Instinctively, Ara adopts a heavily modulated cadence to suppress the hysteria. It is the exact autonomic response she exhibited at Danny's fresh grave. Trauma bonds leave permanent neurological echoes, and those who know your baseline behavior will always recognize your deception. Pushed it to an absolute limit, Marin delivers a harsh ultimatum: terminate this empty charade immediately, or sever their bond forever. The receiver fills with Marin's fractured sobbing. This codependency is systematically destroying them both. Ara experiences acute hyperventilation. The icy diamond drags her consciousness back to the ruthless syndicate boss, Adrian, and his enforcer, Yuri, who possesses the deadpan stare of a clinical psychopath. Cornered, Ara confesses a traumatic event occurred, begging for a moment to regulate her nervous system. Marin pierces the deflection, demanding to know if she is secure. Ara hesitates, then deploys a calculated fabrication. You and I have analyzed this exact pathology before. We manufacture complex lies under the delusion of protecting our loved ones, tragically blind to the reality that our deception only paints a much larger target on their completely innocent backs. Marin's cognitive processing is too rapid to miss that microscopic second where Ara hesitates. She immediately demands the geographic coordinates, prepared to physically extract her friend. But Ara is suffocating in severe emotional dysregulation. She begs for a temporary reprieve, promising a full disclosure tonight. Then, driven by an amygdala hijack, she crosses a profound psychological boundary. She swears on Danny's grave. The line flatlines into an absolute, horrifying silence. In their shared framework, Danny represents an untouchable sanctuary. There is a brutal behavioral lesson here. You must never weaponize the sacred memory of the deceased to orchestrate a momentary escape. Ara has permanently mortgaged her own psychological stability to keep predators away from Marin. Marin's defensive hostility collapses into paralyzing clinical dread. Through a vocal tremor, she promises they will decode this nightmare as a united front. Ara experiences complete physiological constriction of her vocal cords and terminates the connection. Isolated on that mattress, her rigid psychological defenses violently rupture. For the first time in 36 months, Ara exhibits a genuine cathartic release. This is not ethical vocalization, but the systemic collapse of a subject crushed under chronic suppression. It demonstrates a profound psychological truth. The absolute bravest action a traumatized individual can take is abandoning their defensive armor. Bottling up your internal agony will destroy your mental functionality far faster than any external threat could. Her breakdown is triggered by a severe auditory match. Marin's vocal fluctuations perfectly mirrored Danny's final moments. Ara is shattered by cognitive dissonance. Betraying her support system to protect a syndicate architect she met hours prior, an early indicator of Stockholm Syndrome. Her phone's vibration interrupts the episode. An encrypted number transmits Adrian's resonant baritone. Instantaneously, Ara compartmentalizes her grief behind a psychological firewall, reverting to a survival state to interrogate his tracking methods. He projects calculated innocence. Guilt is a relentless parasite occupying the space between fabrications. If you voluntarily initiate a relationship with a known predator, You cannot feign shock when their inherent toxicity incinerates your life. Ara ruthlessly dismantles his manipulative cadence, reminding him he lacks the clearance to utter her name on consecutive days. She bypasses the artificial rapport, demanding his true motives. Adrian requests a 20-minute observation window over coffee, proposing to establish transparency in daylight. She notes the sun has not yet risen, a variable he dismisses with calculated charm. Refusing to be a passive subject, Ara establishes an uncompromising parameter. If she detects a single syndicate operative, she aborts the interaction permanently. He must present himself in absolute isolation. This provides a crucial protocol for psychological preservation. You must establish impenetrable boundaries immediately. Permitting a violation even once guarantees a lifetime of exploitation. Under the clinical fluorescence of the mirror, Ara shocks her nervous system with freezing water. Descending into the sterile lobby, she confirms Adrian's presence. Armored in a dark suit, his micro-expressions reveal severe psychological exhaustion, perfectly mirroring her own depleted baseline. Ara's defensive posture spikes in response to this vulnerability. She resents it because it forcefully humanizes a subject she needs to categorize as a clinical monster. The core diagnostic truth of human nature is profound. We aggressively project resentment onto subjects who accurately mirror our unresolved trauma. Observing your own deep psychological fractures reflected in the tired eyes of an adversary forces a terrifying, unavoidable internal audit of your own soul. Let us examine this cognitive chess match together. Ara sits, and Adrian slides a black coffee across the table. Maintaining an unbroken stare, she bypasses pleasantries and executes a high-stress tactic, demanding the unfiltered truth regarding his father. This cognitive strike visibly fractures his persona. Adrian admits his patriarch called 3 times, but he severed communication to establish baseline trust. He releases the primary variable, Viktor Volkov, a textbook megalomaniac narcissist. Displaying zero autonomic arousal, Ara probes deeper, demanding the mechanics of Viktor's shadow enterprise. The clinical directive is absolute. Aggressively extract the terrifying data points immediately, or drown in the collateral fallout of another person's severe psychological pathology. Any simulated empathy evaporates from Adrian's baseline. He details Viktor's phantom logistics metrics in Indiana Harbor. The surface indicates consumer distribution, but the subterranean reality is a horrific pipeline of human trafficking. An auditory fracture emerges as Adrian confesses to executing associates he knew, purely to sustain this megalomaniac's insatiable appetite. Ara experiences physiological temperature drops, yet forcefully maintains eye contact, demanding his exact functional designation. A psychopathic, generational lineage will metabolically rot your humanity if you lack the psychological fortitude to sever the connection. Cornered by behavioral facts, Adrian classifies his core identity, the syndicate's apex asset for terminal problem resolution. His disclosure saturates the room like a contaminant. He outlines his operative protocol. When an associate breaches hierarchy, he is the mechanism deployed to neutralize the variable. Ara exhibits visible neurological tremors, utilizing the cup to ground her motor functions. She initiates the ultimate diagnostic probe. Have you terminated human life? Adrian attempts to introduce ethical relativism, but she ruthlessly confines him within a binary framework of positive or negative. He vocalizes a degraded affirmative. When she demands the exact mortality metric, his composure disintegrates, requesting a 14-day extension. Suppressing catastrophic variables only ensures the subsequent psychological fallout will result in total, unmitigated systemic annihilation. Observe with me as the power dynamic radically inverts. Adrian petitions to delay quantifying his lethal patterns until her beverage is consumed. Scanning his baseline, Ara no longer registers an apex predator. She perceives a structurally defeated subject suffocating beneath his pathological decisions. She experiences the insidious onset of Stockholm Syndrome, despising her capacity to empathize with his psychological decay. She grants the delay, noting this data collection is merely postponed. Executing a cognitive pivot, she commands a full profile on his enforcer. Empathy is a highly effective observational instrument, but it must never compromise your clinical objectivity. You can map a subject's internal agony while holding them ruthlessly accountable for their choices. Stick with me. You and I are going to open a clinical file on a tragedy that is already in terminal motion. We are observing Adrian, a subject trapped in a suffocating psychological bind. Consider Yuri, a man who once carved the turkey at Adrian's childhood table, now operating as a cold enforcer for the syndicate. For 2 decades, Adrian's father, a classic megalomaniacal narcissist, built an empire until a missing shipment ruptured their reality. Yuri cornered Adrian last night, his affect completely flat, delivering a rigid ultimatum. Adrian has exactly 48 hours to abandon his declining father or face a fatal gunshot by Sunday. This pathology reveals a dark, clinical truth. Sometimes, the hands holding the weapon belong to the very figures who once provided our earliest safety. Observe Adrian's behavioral response. Capitulating to Pavle preserves his biological life, but forfeits his autonomy, trading one violent master for another. This fabricated engagement is a calculated maneuver to sever his traumatic bonds with the underworld. In organized crime, subjects with his lineage do not retire, they are exterminated. By pulling Ara into this dangerous psychological theater, she acts as the fragile pawn. Projecting an artificial vulnerability, he needs the syndicate to observe a fractured man, paralyzed by the terror of losing her. That is precisely why Yuri swallowed the romantic delusion. It teaches us a grim diagnostic truth. People will eagerly absorb any fabrication you present, provided that the lie makes you appear fundamentally powerless. You and I must examine the sheer clinical insanity of this survival protocol. Ara registers her shock that Yuri accepted the ruse, but Adrian operates on a severely compressed timeline. The syndicate initiates violent interrogations in 3 weeks. To survive, their shared illusion requires absolute structural integrity. They must procure a fabricated wedding planner, manipulated photographs, and physical evidence. They will endure tense dinners, holding hands, while megalomaniacal narcissists serve veiled threats. He requires 6 precise weeks of this cognitive distortion to deceive 3 sociopathic crime bosses. If he flees without this psychological shield, his own father will authorize his murder. It is a stark clinical reminder. The most lethal betrayals almost always originate from our primary protectors. We shift focus to Ara, observing her physiological trauma response. She remains frozen, her escalating pulse visible at her throat. She pierces the facade to ask the crucial diagnostic question. Is she playing a future spouse or strictly functioning as a human shield? She is the sole variable preventing his execution. Adrian clinically admits the facts. In 6 weeks, he will effectively cease to exist. But Ara possesses an acute awareness of criminal arithmetic. She demands to know her prognosis when his narcissistic father realizes his son has vanished. Will Yuri be waiting in her apartment to eliminate the witness. This behavioral pattern teaches us a heavy truth. Our desperate attempts to secure our own survival typically drag innocent bystanders directly into the flames. Adrian establishes direct eye contact, delivering a blunt risk assessment. Her survival depends on their ability to execute a flawless, staged separation, and whether he can successfully bribe the correct sociopaths during his extraction. If he performs perfectly, the syndicate ignores her. But then he introduces the fatal variable. A single behavioral misstep transforms her into a loose end that the Mafia will violently amputate. Ara is struck by absolute paralysis. From a clinical perspective, the most jarring element is the environmental dissonance. Civilians consume coffee and soft jazz plays while these two actively negotiate her potential homicide. It reminds us that our internal universe can be totally incinerated, while the external world simply goes about its mundane morning routine. Document the subtle shift in Ara's physical posture. She evaluates the subject who just outlined her assassination with absolute detachment. A cynical smile forms as she highlights a profound psychological irony. For 3 years following the death of her husband, polite society fed her nothing but comforting delusions. They claimed he felt no pain, despite the forensic reality that he bled out on the asphalt. They promised her grief would resolve, yet she remains clinically submerged. She examines the diamond, noting the absurd pathology of her situation. A violent enforcer is the first individual to offer unfiltered honesty, even if it carries a lethal prognosis. Tragedy teaches us a fundamental lesson. A violently harsh truth is always vastly superior to a beautifully constructed deception. She sustains unbroken eye contact, her tremors masked by a sudden surge of adrenaline. She confesses his warning was the most authentic statement she processed in 3 years. She obsessed over the cognitive dissonance that a hitman demonstrated, the baseline empathy to warn her about collateral damage, while her support system offered empty platitudes. Adrian exhibits total paralysis, his defenses neutralized by her raw psychological exposure. He attempts to verbalize further risk factors, but Ara cleanly severs his sentence. Staring directly at an operative of a megalomaniacal syndicate, she affirmatively consents to the 6-week protocol. It is a profound behavioral reminder. Sometimes, the most severely traumatized individuals are the only ones capable of walking directly into the flames. You and I are analyzing the exact moment the interpersonal power dynamic inverts. Ara establishes rigid boundaries. She commits to executing the role perfectly, neutralizing the most predatory figures in his environment. She will fabricate reality with the same dissociative conviction he utilizes, while flatly refusing to become collateral damage. Stripped of his armor, Adrian offers a whispered submission. Then she introduces her final variable. Once he achieves extraction, she will remove the physical evidence and resume her baseline existence. In return, Adrian blindly accepts any compensatory demand. Her ultimate stipulation? He must actually survive the ordeal. It clinically proves that forcing another human to assign value to their own existence is the highest form of grace. Severe traumatic grief possesses a terrifying capacity to rewire neural pathways. We observe Ara dominating a hardened enforcer, mandating that he secure a mundane existence post-extraction. She articulates that her husband's sudden expiration demonstrated the fragility of human biology. Consequently, she forbids him from invalidating this psychological sacrifice. He must construct a reality so insulated that his megalomaniacal father cannot locate him, yet stimulating enough that his trauma loops do not drag him back to the syndicate. This is her sole accepted currency. The ultimate criminal problem solver is left mute, his defenses dismantled. It is a brilliant behavioral lesson. The ultimate retaliation against a violently dark history is the active choice to sustain a profoundly ordinary life. Analyze the clinical tension here. Ara sits opposite a subject whose primary function is violence, yet accepts his parameters. She reports a complete absence of functional affect for 36 months. Adrian lowers his beverage, placing his palm flat like a combatant, relinquishing his firearm, confirming the contract. Ara observes his hand, but avoids contact. This is the exact instrument that authorizes syndicate executions, the appendage that just anchored her with a massive diamond. Yet, beneath her depression, a raw spike of norepinephrine registers. This is the embryonic stage of what we categorize as Stockholm Syndrome. It is decidedly not romance, but severe trauma alters our baseline. And sometimes survival requires latching onto the most lethal mechanism available in the environment. What Ara experienced was light years away from affection. It was merely the primitive instinct of biological self-preservation rebooting her nervous system. Clinically, she despised the sensation. She formally authorizes the 6-week timeline. Issuing a severe warning against failure, he solemnly guarantees optimal compliance. Later, we observe an environmental shift. She approaches her associate, Marin, who throws the door open in distress. Marin exhibits textbook acute stress reaction, facial swelling, paralyzed in the freeze response of panic. Let's examine this together. It highlights a brutal diagnostic reality regarding trauma. Often, survival simply means manipulating your psychology enough to endure the next 300 seconds without suffering a total psychotic break. We observe Marin crushing Ara in a frantic embrace, her grip tight enough to fracture a rib. She sobs, diagnosing Ara as a reckless fool, an assessment her friend quietly accepts. Marin spent the morning spiraling, frantically calling hospitals and the city morgue. As Ara attempts to de-escalate, Marin demands a cognitive breakdown of the events before her mind unravels. She drags Ara inside and engages 2 heavy deadbolts. You and I can see the profound psychological shift. Since the death of her brother Danny, Marin knows physical barriers cannot stop tragedy. When sudden loss shatters the psyche, patients spend their lives trying to lock external threats out. The simple life lesson here is deeply tragic. We often remain entirely blind to the fact that the trauma is already living securely inside our own minds. Ara collapses into a chair, flattening her gloved hands against the table. She maintained this physical barrier all morning. Marin fixates on the fabric, but blood draining from her face, in a classic shock response, and orders the gloves removed. As Ara peels the leather back, Marin ceases respiration entirely. Her gaze locks onto the massive diamond, reflecting the pale light. She processes the transition from that cold syndicate stone to her friend's dissociated eyes. The shock rapidly hardens into fierce aggression. She demands to know why Ara wears a criminal fortune exactly where her deceased brother's wedding band once sat. They had sworn an absolute oath of honesty at his funeral. It is a harsh clinical reminder. Hiding a dark psychological secret to protect someone you love will invariably manifest as the ultimate emotional betrayal. Let us analyze the framing of this behavioral interaction. Ara locks eyes with Marin, the singular individual who physically regulated her nervous system beside a fresh grave. This friend anchored her reality during those early morning panic attacks. Marin is the last living subject who will vocalize Danny's name. Before Ara initiates her confession, she issues a heavy clinical warning. She predicts Marin will want to contact the authorities, alert her husband Marcus, and physically barricade Ara in a secure environment for 6 weeks. From a psychological standpoint, this reaction makes complete sense. The human brain tries to systematically control whatever terrifies it. Yet, the hardest life lesson we ever have to process is simple. You cannot forcefully cage the people you care about, simply to save them from the dark gravity of their disastrous choices. The silence in the room becomes a suffocating psychological weight. Marin processes the terrifying data within that warning, and her posture deteriorates. This is the quiet surrender of a patient sinking under a severe depressive episode. Her knees give out, collapsing into the chair under sudden dread, demanding the factual timeline. Methodically, Ara dissects the anatomy of her cognitive failure. She catalogues the cheap bourbon, a male subject with eyes like winter water, and the auditory thud of a diamond hitting a table. She whispers Yuri Rashevsky's name, noting his flat affect, and admits she accepted this syndicate transaction simply to numb her profound isolation. This behavior teaches an ugly clinical reality. Absolute desperation will consistently force a broken individual to pull up a chair and willingly shake hands with a known predator. Segment by segment, Ara dismantles the fragile cognitive illusion of her stability. She outlines as a scenario where a towering megalomaniac calmly stated her 6-week deployment as a fake fiancé could end with a fatal gunshot. She lists the ruthless syndicate parameters, highlighting her singular condition. Adrian Vulov must be allowed to sever his criminal ties entirely. We observe Marin's micro-expressions shift from pale shock to raw trauma, solidifying into freezing, non-verbal rage. When the debrief concludes, the kitchen feels like a sterile observation room. Marin rises in a dissociative state. She opens a bottle of red wine, pours 2 glasses, and slides one across the granite. It is a stark behavioral reminder. When verbal communication completely fails, humans instinctively rely on quiet, repetitive rituals to brace our nervous systems for the incoming storm. Marin's visual focus locks onto her friend, demanding immediate cognitive accountability. She clinically recaps the unhinged pathology of the arrangement. She questions if Ara is psychologically equipped to wear a $200,000 diamond and simulate domesticity with an antisocial killer. She demands to know if Ara can manufacture genuine effect for 6 weeks to help a criminal evade his violent empire. Ara breaks eye contact, offering a single, monotone affirmative. When Marin aggressively probes for a rational motive, Ara simply fixates on the impossible stone. She has interrogated her own mind 50 times since leaving the hotel, searching for logical justification and finding silence. This is the terrifying reality of pathological grief. Logic loses every ounce of its defensive power once the human spirit has already been entirely shattered. Marin refuses to allow any dissociative evasion. She pins Ara under a clinical gaze, the precise technique used to extract unvarnished psychological truth. Under this targeted interrogation, Ara finally fractures, exposing the core vulnerability she suppressed. She accepted this pathological arrangement because the subject simply asked, expressing basic gratitude, analyze the severe gravity of that stimulus. No one had thanked Ara for anything in 3 agonizing years of mourning. A syndicate boss offered her simple human validation, and her voice breaks as she admits it temporarily reactivated her deadened emotions. The simple life lesson here is critical. Profound, untreated loneliness operates as the ultimate emotional trap, and it will permanently blind a patient to the absolute brightest psychological red flags. Let us observe this behavioral pivot closely together. Ara unconsciously braces for a moral reprimand, but Marin completely subverts those clinical expectations, her vocal register dropping to a dead calm. She states flatly there will be no interventions, no disclosures to Marcus, and no law enforcement involvement. Instead, she will instruct Ara on surviving this descent into an antisocial subculture. Marin asserts she is the sole qualified operative to do so. Ara exhibits profound cognitive dissonance. Marin inhales raggedly, her fine motor control failing exactly as it did the day the funeral home called. Then she delivers a psychological shockwave, whispering that her maiden name was Kamev. It is a vital life lesson. The perfectly normal individuals sitting across from us are frequently bearing the darkest, most violent traumas imaginable. Ara places her glass on the counter with hyper-focused precision, managing it like an unstable explosive. She repeats the name Kamev, her brain struggling to compute its massive implications. In the dim lighting, Marin completely drops her suburban camouflage. She confesses that the notoriously psychopathic syndicate boss, Pavle Kamev, is her biological uncle. She executed a total identity erasure at age 22, maintaining zero contact for 19 years. Her husband was unaware. Danny was unaware. She suppressed this violent lineage under 2 decades of strict behavioral modification. But she must reactivate it tonight. Because Ara blindly wandered into a hostile environment she cannot navigate alone, it proves a harsh life lesson. No matter how deeply you repress your history, the trauma always finds a brutal mechanism to claw back to the surface. The tension induces a feeling of asphyxiation in Ara, who weakly questions the reality of this data. Marin's vocal pattern adopts the cold, detached affect of a seasoned survivalist. She clinically explains her past actions as necessary for self-preservation. At 19, Marin observed her uncle authorize a brutal execution. Within 24 hours, she secured minimal funding and fled to establish an entirely fabricated identity. She severed all familial attachments, fully committed to her suburban integration. But tonight, Ara has introduced the psychological contagion of Viktor Volov's name directly into her safe zone. In behavioral analysis, we observe this phenomenon frequently. It provides a sobering life lesson. You can physically relocate to the absolute ends of the earth, but some violent psychological ghosts simply refuse to stay buried in the dirt. Ara remains in a state of catatonia, the silence manifesting as physical pressure. When Marin issues a command to drink, Ara complies blindly and aspirates, autonomic tears tracking down her face. Marin grasps Ara's bare hand, clinically ignoring the massive syndicate marker beside it. This tactile grounding technique mirrors the one utilized at the cemetery, forcing Ara's consciousness back to the present. Leaning inward, Marin systematically deconstructs the romanticized trauma bond Ara has formed. She diagnoses that Ara has unwittingly entered a generational extinction event. The heir she believes she is rescuing lacks comprehensive situational awareness. Viktor Volov and Pavle Kamev have engaged in mutual slaughter for 31 years. This illustrates a brutal life lesson. Never deploy onto a psychological battlefield that you do not fully comprehend, operating like a profiler mapping a crime scene. Marin dismantles the variables. She exposes the pathological architecture of this feud, detailing how this systemic violence is a malignancy predating modern borders. The subject Ara intends to rehabilitate is the sole successor to the opposing faction. When Ara weakly rationalizes his autonomy, Marin corrects her cognitive distortion, noting that within a syndicate hierarchy he remains functionally infantile. Then, she administers a targeted probe. How old does Ara estimate her uncle is? The clinical reality is 73. Marin questions if an apex predator of that tenure lacks surveillance data. She confirms his operatives acquired Ara's identity by 10 in the morning and her lineage by 2. Here is a sobering life lesson for you and I to remember. True e-privacy is nothing but a highly dangerous cognitive illusion. Let us examine the psychological asphyxiation occurring in this room. Observe the physical manifestations of Ara's acute stress response as she seeks the variable introduced at 4 o'clock. Marin, functioning with the cold detachment of a hardened survivor, clinically explains that the agent kingpin, Pavle Kamev, has deduced his rival's pawn is his own estranged blood. Ara experiences immediate cognitive fragmentation. Marin provides the empirical proof. At 4:11, a syndicate payphone dialed a number dormant for 19 years, delivering a placid invitation to Sunday dinner. This illustrates a haunting behavioral absolute. The pathological roots of our past will always breach the surface, obliterating whatever fragile domestic facade we attempt to construct over them. Note Marin's microexpressions as she articulates the linguistic trigger. The recording addressed her as Marina, an identity suppressed under 19 years of systematic avoidance. We witness Ara's psychological framework collapse at this stimulus. She buries her face, the diamond pressing into her skin like a manifestation of cognitive dissonance. In the agonizing silence, Ara initiates a necessary recalibration. She must disclose this variable to Adrian. He is a lethal operative, yet he gave her an unfiltered assessment of her mortality risk. Withholding critical data from the man ensuring her survival is a fatal miscalculation. This offers a severe clinical observation. Radical transparency remains the sole viable mechanism for stability when one's environment completely collapses. We now document the behavioral threshold of allegiance. Ara anchors her physical posture, rejecting the instinct to flee this psychological impasse. Exhibiting profound parasympathetic control, Marin methodically forces Ara to quantify the collateral damage. Revealing this genetic link transfers jurisdiction over Marin's survival directly to a predatory syndicate heir. Ara exhibits lacrimal distress as she confirms her comprehension. When pressed for her motive, Ara articulates the structural fragility of their alliance. Deception at this juncture guarantees absolute systemic failure. This reinforces a bleak psychiatric reality. Voluntarily dismantling your own defensive frameworks to present the unvarnished truth is often the most perilous behavioral choice a subject can execute. Note the ambient silence. Ara displays involuntary tremors but maintains rigid spinal alignment. She rejects founding her survival on a systemic deception. The interpersonal void becomes clinically oppressive. We then observe an anomalous response. Marin produces a fractional smile. This is not positive affect, but the micro-expression of a psyche fractured by catastrophic pressure. She dictates the operational parameters. Ara may initiate full disclosure, but the subject must be brought into this controlled environment. If she must submit to a syndicate heir, she will do so while asserting absolute territorial dominance. This provides a crucial behavioral directive. Orchestrating the confrontation of your trauma on your own ground is the only method to maintain psychological agency. Let us analyze this shift together. Marin issues a behavioral ultimatum, resolving to establish direct ocular dominance with this predator. The directive induces paralysis in Ara, Marin's effect is devoid of emotional fluctuation. She instructs Ara to mandate his arrival without his security apparatus. No tactical support, just an isolated subject entering their domain. Ara hypothesizes an apex predator will reject this, but Marin remains static. Refusal equates to immediate termination of their alliance. Ara processes the cognitive dissonance of realizing her companion's domesticity was merely sophisticated camouflage. We must recognize a terrifying clinical variable. The true depth of concealed psychological architecture is only revealed when immense environmental pressure is applied. The cognitive illusion completely deteriorates. Ara recognizes that Marin's compliant persona was a fabricated survival mechanism, a psychological shield forged after escaping the criminal underworld. When asked about her disclosure strategy, Marin's microexpressions display zero regret. She intended to compartmentalize this trauma indefinitely, isolating her spouse from the hazardous variables. However, the Syndicate Diamond has catastrophically breached her 19-year dissociative firewall. Stripped of defensive architecture, Marin processes the systemic's collapse with calculated clinical precision. Sompra, her rigid posture provides an essential therapeutic model. When the external environment reaches total failure, establishing a grounded stance in the absolute reality of the crisis is the only viable methodology for survival. Examine the clinical presentation of interpersonal stabilization. Era initiates physical contact to ground Marin's neurological tremors. She commits to triggering the confrontation immediately. They will pull this megalomaniac narcissist into their space, neutralizing the threat through collective endurance. Marin's emotional suppression fractures, yet she strictly reinforces her behavioral parameters. The boundaries are non-negotiable. If he arrives with tactical support, the negotiation is aborted. The asset will be discarded, and they will initiate an evasion protocol. This dictates a fundamental rule of psychological preservation. Implementing rigid, absolute boundaries is the ultimate cognitive defense mechanism when facing a lethal, existential threat. Observe Ara's cognitive shock. She asks if Marin would truly initiate a total abandonment of her life. Marin maintains an unflinching, baseline affirmative. She has avoided travel for years, yet is prepared for immediate extraction. The resilient subject then undergoes an acute psychological decompensation. 19 years of suppressing lethal data violently expels itself. She manages the emotional response, mandating Ara execute the call before her nervous system overrides her resolve. Note the fine motor tremors as Ara dials. Adrian connects on the second ring, his respiratory patterns audibly dysregulated. This offers compelling clinical data on attachment. Authentic alliances demand the willingness to dismantle your own sanctuary to stabilize a cohort in crisis. The anxiety transmitted through the receiver is clinically significant. Adrian demands an assessment of the crisis. Guided by Marin, Ara dictates the parameters. He must arrive stripped of all tactical advantage. No security. No weapons. Adrian experiences cognitive paralysis, questioning the rationality of entering an unsecured zone while their alliance is unstable. Ara issues an unmodulated affirmative. The subsequent silence is heavy with anticipatory dread. When he demands a motive, Ara applies psychological leverage. Their arrangement requires radical transparency. He must process this data tonight, or the contract is nullified. This illustrates a critical behavioral metric. Enforcing demands for unfiltered honesty is the only way to construct an impermeable bond. Let us evaluate this silence together. When Adrian exhales, his cultivated armor dissolves. His affect lacks defensive mechanisms. As he requests the coordinates, his next articulation catastrophically disrupts the emotional baseline. He tells Ara that should this be an assassination protocol, he preemptively absolves her of moral culpability. He neutralizes the burden of his own termination before entering the hostile zone. The camera records Ara's acute distress. Her vocal cords undergo temporary paralysis. Relinquishing basic survival instincts is a terrifying cognitive free fall. Yet, providing this level of psychological grace reveals a fascinating behavioral profile. It demonstrates that genuine allegiance only manifests where biological self-preservation terminates. This is a clinical breaking point. Marin observes Ara's decompensation, yet her baseline remains stable. She replenishes their wine with unwavering ocular fixation. Ara forces a dysregulated whisper to finalize the parameter, and Adrian confirms his transit. The call terminates. The syndicate diamond refracting the light serves as the irreversible demarcation of their timeline. Both subjects exist in oppressive silence, anticipating the stressor. At 9:41, 3 controlled impacts register on the door. There is no chaotic acoustic signature, merely the calculated cadence of a man prepared for his mortality. This offers critical behavioral data. When a catastrophic variable breaches your perimeter, maintaining physiological calm is the singular metric for surviving the shockwave. When Marin stands, the atmospheric pressure becomes clinically suppressive. She asserts her intent to open the door with rigid cognitive conviction. The air must submit to direct ocular interrogation before entering. Ara physically withdraws. We frequently observe these behavioral dead ends where rational mediation is futile. The deadbolts disengage with the severity of ballistic discharge. Marin exposes the threshold. Adrian stands in the corridor, entirely isolated. His hands present no threat, no tactical backup, no armaments. Yet Marin's trauma has conditioned her against trusting an absence of visual stimuli. This establishes a universal psychological axiom. Lethal threats rarely announce themselves with overt hostility. It is the concealed asymptomatic variables that violently drag a subject into terminal darkness. Observe the physiological response here. Marin's visual sweep is a classic predatory assessment. She addresses him as Mr. Volov, stripping his cover. He attempts the socially expected Mrs. Quinn, a textbook deflection mechanism. But she shatters his baseline reality by confirming she recognizes his syndicate pathology. Notice his micro-expressions, the sudden freezing of his motor functions, the immediate visual anchor he seeks in Ara's pales. He is a man cornered by a ghost. Only when he finds his psychological tether does his vagus nerve regulate, dropping his shoulders a fraction. When trauma violently pushes an individual to the absolute edge, taking a blind step into the terrifying unknown remains the bravest psychological move of all. Step into this clinical observation room with me and listen to the definitive snap of those deadbolts. Marin is constructing a physical and psychological quarantine. Adrian sits in the shadows, his sharp features masking a severe internal panic. When his voice cracks, asking if Ara is unharmed, we are hearing the raw frequency of a man losing his emotional anchor. Ara offers a flat, dissociative denial, pushing him back into his chair like a caged animal. At the head of the table, Marin slides a glass of red wine forward, a brilliant use of visual intimidation. She states her maiden name, Kanev. It is a calculated donation of identity. Confronting a buried, lethal history is the only true method to break a narcissistic trauma bond and reclaim your stolen identity. The psychological density in this kitchen is suffocating. Marin executes this revelation with the dispassionate calm of a forensic pathologist making an incision. 19 years of repressed survivors' guilt bleed across the marble island. Adrian's sympathetic nervous system completely shuts down. We watch him press both palms flat against the stone, a primal gesture of absolute surrender. His voice drops to a lethal frequency, demanding the exact coordinates of her genetic timeline. Without a single blink, Marin identifies Pavli as her blood uncle. She severed her ties to a ruthless syndicate as a mere adolescent. Severing a toxic family root requires unimaginable cognitive fortitude, right? But securing your sanity is always worth the heavy price of total amputation. Let us examine the catastrophic gravity crushing these subjects together. Marin has intentionally detonated 19 years of meticulous behavioral conditioning. Her civilian husband sleeps entirely unaware, while Ara remains locked in acute stress paralysis. Adrian leans forward, his facial muscles locking into defensive hostility as he demands the logical motive behind breaking her phantom state. Marin counters with surgical precision, targeting Ara's diamond ring, a tangible symbol that functions as a literal syndicate death warrant. Ara meets his gaze with tearful, reckless defiance. True psychological honesty is rarely a comfortable procedure, but it remains the only viable anchor when an individual's entire manufactured reality violently collapses into pieces. The physical environment plunges into an auditory void, broken only by Ara hyperventilating, a classic panic response. Adrian remains entirely immobilized, a man whose entire cognitive map has just been annihilated. He uses the wine as a chemical stabilizer, swallowing it to suppress the visible tremors in his hands. He then locks onto Marin with a flattened stare, initiating a rapid-fire interrogation. Did her uncles engineer this? No. Did he initiate contact? Yes. Did she reply? Never. Does the syndicate know he sits in this very chair? Negative. They exist in a pure, suspended vacuum, severed from the world. The most resilient psychological alliances are never formed in safety. They are hammered out in the darkest, most desperate trenches of mutual survival. Notice the rigid, mechanical precision governing Marin's posture. She calculates their exact survival window with the detached efficiency of a seasoned operative. Her husband is occupied until midnight, starting a ruthless 90-minute countdown. Adrian studies her facial geometry in the shadows, a reluctant respect softening his armor. Marin leans forward, coldly reminding him she survived this lethal environment long before playing the domesticated wife. A micro-expression of amusement finally touches Adrian's mouth. The previous power dynamic is totally obliterated. He now holds a decoy cry and a highly lethal syndicate anomaly. It proves that no matter how deep you bury a pathological history, the trauma always claws its way back to the surface to demand a final reckoning. The focal point shifts to Marin's hands, her knuckles flashing bone-white against the glass. She is experiencing acute threat anticipation, terrified he will weaponize her identity. Adrian processes her dilated pupils. In a profound fracture of his narcissistic shell, his vocal pitch drops, swearing he will never exploit her confession, while Ara softly weeps, paralyzed by a budding Stockholm syndrome. Adrian demands they dissect the nightmare closing in. He requests 40 minutes of the exact same survival instinct that kept Marin alive for 2 decades. A single, erratic breath escapes her as she consents. It highlights a grim paradox of human psychology. Sometimes, transferring your trust to a known predator is the only logical method to escape complete extermination. Stay close because you and I are about to watch a megalomaniacal empire clinically implode. Adrian takes a slow drink, using the alcohol to regulate his central nervous system. His father, the supposedly immortal kingpin Vittorio, is rotting from a terminal cellular breakdown. Ara sits completely catatonic. The patriarch has hidden this biological failure for 11 months. Adrian has carried the psychological weight of this impending death alone. Marin slowly shuts her eyes as the chaotic behavioral patterns of the underworld suddenly align. Vittorio's decaying body is the exact trigger for her uncle's manic power grab. The looming shadow of mortality ruthlessly strips away our defense mechanisms, forcing us to face the desperate, broken people standing right beside us. The atmosphere turns violently claustrophobic as Adrian dissects the behavioral fallout. Marin's uncle detected the scent of biological weakness. Reading the fading cognitive state of the current regime, he perceived a fractured hierarchy, but miscalculated the pathological depth of the rot. Marin anchors her hands to the table, demanding the unfiltered reality. Adrian's voice hollows out. Look, the dying kingpin is not processing his mortality with peace. He is aggressively liquidating assets, cashing in decades of sociopathic blood debts. He is constructing a psychological pyre to incinerate his own bloodline. Adrian alone possesses the cognitive map to survive this. It exposes a grim clinical truth. The heaviest chains we carry are the unbroken traumas our fathers hand down to us. The tragic irony of this clinical profile hangs heavily over them. Recently, federal surveillance punctured the kingpin's narcissism, triggering severe paranoia. Vittorio handed his son the organizational keys, demanding absolute loyalty. But closely analyze Adrian's facial tension here. He is not executing his father's blueprint to salvage the syndicate. He is using it as an accelerant to incinerate the entire structure. This represents a profound psychological rupture. Realizing the monster you must eradicate is the creator who molded your psyche. Ara weakly asks how this sequence terminates. Adrian's eyes reflect zero empathy. He plans to feed the authorities enough data to bury everyone. True moral correction often requires completely burning down the toxic house that built you. Marin emits a hollow laugh. Until 3 hours ago, Ara functioned as the optimal civilian shield, a psychological blank slate. Adrian executes a slow nod, confirming his manipulation. He paints a catastrophic behavioral outcome. In 21 days, tactical units will breach their wedding rehearsal. 41 apex sociopaths will be neutralized. Ara will be the sole innocent variable, subjected to immense trauma under the media spotlight. That scrutiny will inevitably force Marin out of her 19-year dissociation. Marin begins to experience visible somatic tremors, demanding the exact scope of the casualty list. Adrian does not blink. Everyone is marked for slaughter. We construct massive mental fortresses to protect ourselves, but pure darkness always finds a microscopic fracture to bleed through. A crushing pressure of betrayal floods the room. You and I have seen this pathological climax before. Marin's expression locks into profound disgust. She asks if Adrian engineered this psychological damage from the start. He does not flinch, delivering a brutally cold affirmative. He systematically groomed a vulnerable woman, luring her into a confined space with predatory narcissists. He gave Ara the diamond, knowing it was destined for an evidence locker. The camera rests on his static frame, his lack of empathy serving as a clinical confession. Ara stares into the void, her Stockholm syndrome fracturing as she realizes her romance was a calculated slaughter. We often romanticize deeply disturbed individuals, completely blind to how efficiently they will sacrifice us. Today, you and I are going to unpack this case file together. This is the precise clinical moment the armor fractures. Adrian was prepared to immolate his lineage, requiring a proxy resilient enough to withstand the trauma. He profiled Ara, calculating that a grieving widow could absorb his deception. Under the harsh kitchen lights, she finally pierces his fabricated persona. His affect is terrifyingly flat, but the defensive splitting is failing. Beneath the tailored facade of a syndicate heir is an isolated man suffocating on unprocessed grief. It serves as a haunting behavioral truth we must all accept. Profound, unresolved trauma will consistently seek out its mirrored reflection, hiding quietly in the hollowed eyes of another human being. The observation centers on Adrian, a subject preemptively mourning Vittorio, a megalomaniac narcissist he is actively conspiring to eradicate. Adrian sits paralyzed by the cognitive dissonance of betraying his bloodline, suffocating inside an exit strategy he spent 2 years engineering. It required dragging a traumatized civilian into the underworld. Ara whispers his name, her tone carrying the sharp edge of panic. She interrogates their baseline of honesty, asking if he ever intended to go to warn her about the federal raid. The room drops into dead silence before Adrian rasps a defeated confirmation. It exposes a bitter psychological paradox seen in clinical practice. The unfiltered truth we desperately demand is almost always the instrument that inflicts the deepest laceration. Ara exhibits an acute hyperarousal response, consumed by hostility as she demands the timeline of his premeditated confession. Adrian admits his projection was a 3-week delay. He intended to withhold the variables until after his father gala, trapping her in a fabricated reality. Ara recalls, stating this coercive control was never their baseline. Adrian intellectualizes his behavior, arguing he promised an absence of explicit lies, not the omission of secrets. You and I have probably both witnessed this catastrophic cognitive distortion. Ara escalates her retaliation, refusing to let him manipulate the semantics of trust out of sheer self-preservation. Human behavior consistently demonstrates that a calculated half-truth is simply cowardice masquerading as a technicality. Analyze the environmental stresses in this dim kitchen. Ara is hyperventilating, demanding the catalyst for his sudden unmasking. Adrian, exhibiting the despair of a drowning man, drops his behavioral shields. He ruptured his timeline because Marin revealed her authentic surname. He deduced that maintaining the deception would permanently sever their trauma bond. He opted to risk immediate abandonment rather than sustain a pathological lie. Ara remains frozen in the shadows. Her physiological tremors are so severe that the massive diamond reflects her fragmented psyche. This observation highlights a vital human foundation. Absolute transparency, even when it violently deconstructs our reality, is the only psychological bedrock that prevents a relational collapse. The cognitive dissonance here is palpable. Ara outlines the objective data. They have shared proximity for a mere 24 hours, yet this predator sits paralyzed by a 19-year vendetta, willing to self-sabotage his exit strategy to maintain honesty with her. Adrian holds her gaze, entirely devoid of his psychopathic armor. There is no manipulation left, only radical exposure. The terrifying enforcer has dissolved, leaving behind a profoundly damaged individual breathing erratically in the dark. In clinical profiling, this pattern is incredibly common. We exhaust our psychological resources constructing impenetrable defenses, yet authentic connection only materializes when we finally drop the shield and allow someone to examine the fractured pieces behind the mask. This is the critical juncture where the subject voluntarily disarms. Adrian confesses she is the singular individual in 12 years who perceives a human being rather than a sociopathic instrument on Vittorio's chessboard. The silence is clinically profound. Ara exhibits breath-holding behavior under the gravity of this admission. Then, Marin places her glass down with the authority of a judge, establishing a rigid boundary. She will vacate the premises for exactly 5 minutes. They have 5 minutes to finalize their trajectory. This aggressive time constraint reveals a fundamental behavioral reality. Pivotal psychological turning points rarely offer a period of slow deliberation. You must frequently forge your definitive path while the clock is mercilessly ticking down. Adrian lowers his posture, demonstrating complete psychological surrender. Marin remains entirely unswayed. She locks eyes with this unconditioned killer and enforces a non-negotiable ultimatum. If Ara chooses self-preservation, he must sever the attachment, return to his violent syndicate, and never initiate contact again. Adrian complies instantly and Marin exits. Stick with me here because the atmospheric pressure is suffocating. It is just the subjects and that diamond sitting between them like unexploded ordnance. Ara realizes the next 60 seconds will permanently alter her neural pathways. When extreme trauma backs a subject into a corner, their core psychological profile bleeds out, and every subsequent actions carries a permanent, irreversible consequence. This interval triggers a massive autonomic response for Ara. Rather than engaging a flight response, she transitions into acute hyperfocus. We are observing the clinical crystallization of Stockholm Syndrome. She informs Adrian she is remaining in the hazardous environment. The syndicate air visibly decompensates in relief, but Ara immediately asserts dominance. She commands a complete restructuring of his operational tactics. He must manipulate the federal raid to ensure her total anonymity, flatly refusing the role of collateral damage. This underscores a crucial behavioral adaptation. A subject never has to accept the role of passive victim. We all possess the latent capacity to actively restructure the parameters and fiercely secure our own psychological survival. Her cognitive framing is relentless. She mandates Marin be expunged from databases, neutralizing the threat of Vittorio's collapse. The passive widow persona is overwritten by a subject exercising extreme agency. She bluntly states that a mastermind capable of funding a massive engagement as can construct a secondary protocol. She then introduces her primary condition, requiring complete access to his suppressed behavioral history, every violent altercation and the empirical body count he accumulated. She demands the unredacted pathology of his violence. This serves as a critical directive for human attachment. You cannot construct a stable bond on deception. A viable future always requires dragging every buried psychological skeleton directly into the harsh clinical light. Ara rejects the symbol of his commitment unless she comprehends his pathological past. The weight of his trauma is staggering. Yet Adrian suppresses his defenses and consents to radical transparency. Ara then executes a masterful psychological pivot. She dictates that once Vittorio's criminal structure is decimated, he must approach her devoid of coercive authority. He must proposition her as a civilian, providing the autonomy to engage or withdraw. You and I should closely examine this clinical deconstruction of abuser-victim power dynamics. Authentic connection is never derived from enforcing compliance or manipulating a trauma bond. Healthy stability requires executing the arduous internal work and possessing the fortitude to leave the exit parameters entirely unobstructed. She tests his behavioral limits until the illusion fragments. Ara stipulates that if she rejects him, he must permanently dissociate and cultivate functional independence. Observing this predator process the terror of abandonment is a profound clinical study. Severance is his therapeutic penalty. She then establishes her final parameter. If she consents, he must discard the blood-stained capital and procure a token funded by legitimate labor. They must detoxify their environment from Vittorio's influence. This highlights a principle of behavioral rehabilitation. You cannot purchase psychological absolution using the toxic currency of your pathological history. Genuine recovery requires dismantling the false infrastructure and rebuilding from a baseline of zero. Ara proposes cognitive restructuring, rejecting the archetypes of narcissistic heir and captive. She intends for them to integrate as traumatized subjects who adapted. Adrian, the architect of the syndicate's collapse, experiences expressive aphasia. Ara maintains her rigid boundary. Gradually, the enforcer's dissociative barriers dissolve, resulting in emotional catharsis as he accedes to every demand. Marin re-enters precisely on schedule. She assesses the weeping subject, and the hyper-vigilant widow retrieves her beverage and inquires if they are finalizing the protocol. This verifies a critical therapeutic axiom. No matter how severe the psychological lacerations are, if you commit to the grueling internal work, you can construct a highly functional reality from the scattered debris. Ara validates their commitment to the protocol. Marin exhales a plea for divine intervention. You and I must analyze the weight of this imagery. Adrian elevates his glass. The hands once used for lethal precision are now compromised by visible tremors. This is a striking diagnostic visual. 3 disparate profiles finalize their pact. We advance the timeline 6 weeks to the port at 4 in the morning. The federal intervention operates with clinical efficiency. 41 syndicate variables are neutralized without a single gunshot, including the megalomaniacal patriarch. It substantiates our final conclusion. The most seismic reorganizations of the human condition do not occur with explosive spectacle. True transformation happens in absolute silence, under the cover of darkness. You and I are going to unpack this final phase together. The morning papers document the collapse, but Ara and Marin vanish from the record. That March, in a sterile room, Victor breathes his last. He dies untouched by the law, the ultimate evasion by a megalomaniac narcissist. The true psychological tragedy sits right there in the shadows. Adrian watches his father expire, blind to the reality that his own son engineered this ruin. Cut to April. Ara steps from a dusty clinic into the sun, finding Adrian by a plain, grey sedan. His weapons and suits are gone. He stands with empty hands. In my line of work, we expect explosive finales, but severe trauma usually ends in a whisper. True peace only finds us the second we choose to set down our heavy ghosts. Observe her bare hand. The suffocating diamond has been gone for 6 weeks, abandoned in the dirt when the syndicate burned. She studies Adrian's palm, holding a simple metal band. This is no $200,000 collar of ownership. It is a quiet promise from a man stripped of his armor. I often analyze Stockholm Syndrome, where victims bond with captors to survive. But the tension leaving her shoulders signals true recovery, not a trauma bond. Ara shows her first genuine smile in 3 agonizing years, whispering a soft yes. They walk away from the wreckage, never looking back. It reveals a profound human truth. The heaviest chains we carry are often forged from shiny gold, and real freedom only begins the moment we refuse to look over our shoulders.